All right. We're at 2 minutes past. Adam, what do you think? Should we jump in?
Let's do it.
All right. Well, first off, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. We're very excited to tell you a bit more about wildfire mitigation programs, what they look like, how they can benefit the risk-aware utility, and how they can be a strong component to building a risk analytics program. So to start things off, Adam, I'll pass it off to you.
Great, thank you. Flip to the next slide, please. Just some brief introductions. I'm Adam Corneal, Senior Director of Advanced Analytics at Logic 2020. I oversee much of our utility analytics work, including that in wildfire mitigation, vegetation management, and some more risk programs. And I have with me today Christian White, one of our data scientists focused especially on vegetation management, who brings really some expert insights both in the data and also the practicalities of vegetation management. And Caitlin Petronglo, Senior Manager in Advanced Analytics, who works hands-on, especially in some of the risk modeling, risk spend efficiency, and public safety power shutoff programs with some of our clients. So we're very excited to share, and thank you to all who are joining us. If you could flip to the next slide, please. We've got an agenda today to go over sort of the background of wildfire mitigation, where we are today and what problems we're trying to solve with WMPs, and then a quick rundown of what wildfire mitigation plans are and how to think about them in context with utility operations, and then the place that risk modeling takes in addressing that wildfire problem, and especially going a little bit deeper on the vegetation piece of that, which obviously is very critical. And lastly, we'll wrap up with a couple of thoughts on how to practically advance these kinds of programs and make them part of your toolkit to meet the problems and the regulatory requirements. So with that, we'll jump right in. I'll start us off here. So if you could flip to the next slide, please. Just wanted to touch on for a moment some of the background around wildfire mitigation. It's captured a lot of public attention about 5 years ago as we saw increasing wildfire issues along the West Coast, and also increased regulatory attention, including in 2019, the CPUC requesting IOUs to develop WMP programs to meet the need. And in that time, the California utilities have really stepped up to the plate and have been addressing this problem in a very comprehensive and data-driven way that as we are across the country thinking about how to address wildfire mitigation, there are some serious lessons learned there that I think we can use to more quickly adopt practices that are efficient and effective, even in other territories that face a different mix of problems versus the West Coast. So if you could flip to the next, please. Just to illustrate a little bit, we have unfortunately been seeing increased prevalence of wildfires and drought and other vegetation-driven problems throughout the country of the last few years, and project to unfortunately see wider territories impacted by these kinds of problems over the next 20 years. That in concert with the growth of electrification, the growth of generation, the growth of distributed energy resources means that we have a significant problem to tackle here. And if we're going to do so efficiently, we need to look to new approaches, including analytics, to tackle this problem without simply scaling up more and more vegetation inspections that come at a high cost and labor. So if you could go to the next slide, please. One other factor in all of this, aside from that electrification and obviously the climate changes pushing this, is also our growth. So as we see urban areas growing, we are seeing an increase in the interface between those urban areas and areas of high risk for wildfire. So areas where we've got vegetation that may experience drought and become fuel for these issues, it just increases the surface area of the problem. And so staying abreast of this means staying abreast of the development of the electrical grid, but also the topography of the service territory, including not just the vegetation and the climate conditions, but also the urban footprint and the people impacted. And so we tend to think about this as a sort of three-legged stool of the potential for incidents to occur, the potential for when those ignitions occur, wildfire to spread and create damage, and the preparedness and the vulnerability of the populations at risk by those events. All three of these really need to be thought of in concert to drive the decisions to help address them. If you could skip to the next slide, please. We're not alone here. So in addition to the lessons that we can learn from the progress that's been made in addressing these issues on the West Coast, there is also federal support for meeting these challenges. So while we may see increased regulation across the country requiring WMPs and other programs to meet this problem, the Infrastructure Investment Act has also provided us over $10 billion in the GRIP program to help fund closing the gap. And this can be applied to a variety of different reliability and safety related projects. But to date, 34% of that funding has gone to wildfire mitigation and is an important source to be able to make these changes in addition to regular rates. So just wanted to give a little bit of background there about how the WMP has come into play as part of utility planning. I'll hand it off next to Caitlin to talk us through a little bit about what those WMPs actually look like.
Thank you, Adam. All right, so before I jump into my section, just want to remind everybody, if you have questions, we'd love to answer them at the end of the webinar. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat. We'll read them out, we'll give it some thought, and then we'll have a dialogue. All right, well, that being said, let's jump into wildfire mitigation planning for the risk-aware utility. Risk-aware utilities are utilities that understand the comprehensive risk in their service territories, and they build that understanding using data. A wildfire mitigation plan aligns risk reduction efforts across the entire utility. A WMP is a matrixed program. There really isn't a part of the utility that it can't impact or doesn't influence in some way when done effectively. From the strategy that underlies the WMP that informs the mission and goals of the program, to operations and activities that are already ongoing, like grid ops, vegetation management, asset management, construction, emergency outreach and preparedness. A WMP coalesces all of these different lines of business activities together and aligns them on a risk reduction strategy using risk modeling and tools. A risk-aware utility uses risk modeling to make decisions about wildfire mitigation, but also wildfire mitigation can have other positive impacts in other areas of the utility, such as improving reliability, improving safety. It's not only about reducing wildfire risk and reducing the risk of utility-owned assets, but also about building a stronger utility overall. Typically, when a utility stands up a WMP, we're looking at kind of three main functional areas that the WMP can impact: emergency response, operations, and strategic planning and grid investment. Utilities that are currently experiencing high wildfire risk in their service territories or nearby their service territories, or who have had occurrences of large fires or destructive fires, will often choose to focus on emergency response. A lot of times, this involves building a PSPS, public safety power shutoff program. That's a program that engages the whole utility, requires coordination and direct responsibility from the Emergency Operations Center. It often operationalizes a risk management framework for wildfire across the enterprise, and it involves grid ops and infrastructure. There are a lot of ongoing operations that can also be optimized through WMP programs. Vegetation management is one of them. Christian's going to tell us about that later. Also impactful is asset management, asset health. Adam mentioned one of the factors in wildfire are utility-owned assets in an aging grid that is having increased demand due to factors like electrification. And then finally, many utilities are thinking about strategic planning. Climate change is happening. It's causing weather patterns to change. It is causing increased temperatures in areas that used to be cooler. And so while utilities may not have fires in their service territory today, they're planning 3, 5, 10 years out to anticipate how climate change may raise risk. There are a lot of different initiatives and programs that fall under wildfire mitigation. This slide shows you a few. I will not go through everything, but I'll highlight a couple things. We talked about PSPS. That is one of the kind of flagship emergency response programs that utilities are building out. A lot of utilities on the West Coast have PSPS. We're also seeing it expand out. Colorado, Texas are starting to have their own PSPS programs to deal with emerging fire threat. Emergency and responsive coordination, right? If an emergency happens, whether it's wildfire, whether it's storm, whether it's an earthquake, coordination with local authorities, having communication processes in place is going to be very important. Across the country, red flag warnings tell us when wildfire threat is high. And so utilities already have a heads up from the National Weather Association on fire threat conditions like high wind speeds over 15 miles per hour, sustained wind speeds, high temperature, and wind direction and wind height. Alongside all of these programs is going to be investment in infrastructure, investment in technology, investment in enhanced data capture, and risk modeling can really direct this investment. So a lot of times utilities know they have risk. Maybe they haven't quantified it yet, but they're not sure where to meaningfully invest. So in terms of grid hardening and strategic planning, risk modeling can kind of direct those dollars into the right place at the right time. For this reason, risk-aware utilities are realizing tangible value from WMP initiatives that extend beyond simply preventing ignition. So the risk-aware utility sees improvement in reliability, fewer outages, customers enjoying consistent, reliable power, reduced liability. It's very important to utilities to serve the customer, keep reliability up, keep costs down, right? Liability gets passed on to the customer in the form of increased rates. And so it's great when those catastrophes don't happen, and it's great when customer safety can be a part of grid investment, a part of that ROI. And then finally, vegetation management. This is a very essential component of risk management and just management across the grid. It can also be very expensive, especially as customers begin to move into areas that are heavily wooded and heavily forested. Vegetation management that's been optimized with risk modeling reduces unnecessary truck rolls, reduces carbon emissions, protects the safety of crews by, having them not have to go out and do dangerous tree trims if it's not necessary, if it's not actually reducing risk. And then, of course, prevents outages and ignitions from vegetation contact. Vegetation contact is one of the leading causes of utility ignitions. So we've talked a bit about the WMP, what it looks like, how it impacts the different lines of business and programs, activities across the utility. Now we're going to talk about risk modeling specifically for wildfire. We'll dive into some of the methodologies that are often used to do wildfire risk modeling, some of the data points that are needed, and kind of what a mature risk modeling program looks like. Wildfire risk models calculate the likelihood and consequence of wildfire. So utilities want to know what's the probability that a wildfire can happen, right? Where the ignition point is a utility-owned asset. What conditions and factors increase or decrease the likelihood of an ignition occurring on a certain day, years out in the future, or even looking historically to plan strategic investment. And then this is helpful to know, but what we really need to know is what's the likelihood, and then if an ignition happens, what is the consequence? There are different methodologies for consequence, quite a few. One that we often use is reliability, safety, and financial. So if an ignition happens, how far could the fire spread? How many acres could be burned? How many buildings could be destroyed? What customers would be impacted, right? What customers live in that area of the service territory? How would they be impacted if a fire compromised where they live, or if a fire caused an outage, right? From a reliability perspective, some customers require life-saving devices that require electricity. And so a big part of wildfire consequence is looking at not just how many customers live in an area, but what are their medical needs, right? Do they require the grid because they are using oxygen or a ventilator or a different type of device, right? That's essential to their health. Safety impacts, some ways that this can be estimated are population, social vulnerability, which I just mentioned. This is also an area where AI ethics and bias is very important, right? Making sure that those estimates are equitable for all customers. And then outage. An outage can have a lot of negative impacts to the utilities, safety metrics, to customer experience, and just the kind of overall integrity of the utility. So we think about likelihood. Could a fire occur? Consequence, what will happen if a fire does occur? Now, if we kind of pull this up and look at the whole methodology, I want to talk specifically about the drivers of risk. A utility that is transforming to be a risk-aware utility and a risk-responsive utility is going to spend a lot of time internally aligning on definitions of risk, identifying risk scenarios, identifying drivers of risk, and then starting to look at the data that the utility has available or that the utility can obtain to model those relationships out. And that really is what risk modeling and risk intelligence is for the utility. It's a combination not just of numbers and math and data, but also process, subject matter expertise, and understanding oriented towards business goals. So thinking about this type of methodology and how it relates back to the likelihood and consequence calculations that often underlie wildfire mitigation risk modeling, we think about ignition points. Utilities are generally concerned with factors that could cause an ignition of an asset that they own. But if there is a fire in the service territory, then energized lines could potentially accelerate that fire. And so risk modeling can not only be used to predict utility-caused fire, but also to inform activities if a fire is simply nearby or in the service territory. Most fires are caused by human factors. Somewhere around 20% of fires are caused by natural factors like lightning strikes, which are very hard to predict, but do require response. In terms of utility factors, vegetation contact is going to be one of the #1 ways that an ignition can happen. a branch touches a line, conditions are very hot, there's a conduction of electricity, it can cause sparks, it can cause an ignition. If the sparks fall into very dry fuels that maybe are underneath, then we're seeing a situation where a fire can ignite. Then we're looking at consequence, right? The ignition has happened. What's the consequence? Animal contact, something as simple as a squirrel running across a line, a bird flying between two conductors can cause sparks that can cause an ignition. Outages and failures from overhead equipment are one of the #1 ways that a fire can start. Things like vehicle contact, modeling can be so precise as to predict if the location of a pole makes it at risk for being hit by a vehicle, right? If a pole ignites, that can start a fire. And then asset failures and outages, this is a component related to the aging utility grid, but also different characteristics and attributes like the brand of an asset, the material it's made out of, the weather conditions that surround it, and other factors like damage, even debris from an active fire falling on top of some equipment, or even transmission, distribution or transmission, could cause the debris to heat and then to fall down onto the ground and cause an ignition. So there are many different ways an ignition can happen, and those can all be modeled with data. We couple the ignition points and we map them with drivers, right? So things like topography, fire burns faster uphill, vegetation, right? What's the location of trees in respect to a conductor? What are weather conditions like historically throughout the year? Or if you're trying to do modeling to inform emergency response, what are weather conditions like today or forecasted in the next few days? Fuels, what kind of fuels are present on the ground? The moisture content of those fuels are going to increase or decrease risk. Adam mentioned factors like land use. So land settlement patterns can be a risk driver, as can land use, right? Is a pole near a parking lot, or is it in a heavily wooded area? Is it behind someone's house? Is it near a school? Those types of factors can bring risk up or down and can affect ultimately the risk score associated with a given asset. These drivers impact likelihood. They also impact consequence. When we think about safety, reliability, and financial, right? All of these factors can increase or decrease that score. When we unite likelihood and consequence together, we get a comprehensive risk score that can be used for decision making. Now, one thing I will mention about this kind of modeling is, yes, wildfire modeling typically requires a good amount of data. A lot of utilities have this data, right? Utilities tend to have data on their assets, outages, customer information. It will almost always take some finessing to get this data into a format that is high quality and trustworthy for modeling. That's always the case. It's part of the fun of data science. And we usually would require as well some environment data, things that can describe land use, weather, climate predictions. A lot of this information is publicly available, which is great. And efficiency here is that for wildfire modeling, we need utility data and environment data. We need that kind of data for other modeling applications as well. And so utilities that invest in wildfire risk modeling are also getting a head start on different types of models and model use cases, like asset risk, vegetation risk, storm risk, right? There are other types of natural disasters that utilities need to worry about, and even estimated time to restore models. Utilities that start risk modeling typically find value in it and begin to iteratively invest in making data more widely available for decision making. Risk models can be layered together, right? There are wildfire risk models, there are fire simulation models that show expected spread of a fire, expected areas burned, right? Fire science models, vegetation risk models, asset health risk models. These can be layered together alongside other data, right? Like real-time weather data, information about the grid, where are the circuits. You can look at spans, you can look at segments, you can look at conductors. All of this information together becomes very powerful. utilities want to look historically at risk, right? What did the grid look like 5 years ago? What does the grid look like today, especially for emergency response or operations? And then really importantly, what will the grid look like tomorrow, right? You can use this kind of modeling to simulate what if scenario analysis and actually look ahead and say, if the average temperature raises by just 1 degree in the next 10 years, how will risk change across the service territory? We can layer in GIS and asset information. A lot of utilities have some of this information and data ready and available. And ultimately, we can look at different use cases and have a comprehensive view of risk by looking at the outputs of different risk models and holding them together for decision making. We can also do vegetation management. And so I'm excited to pass it over to Christian next. She's going to take us through a deep dive of vegetation management, how risk analytics and modeling can optimize that process, reduce costs, and bring in great efficiencies for the utility. So Christian, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Caitlin. Hi, y'all. I'm Christian, and I'll be discussing some of the growing challenges in modern utility vegetation management operations. And you can full well groan at that pun. Next slide, please. But as climate change accelerates, utilities are going to face heightened risks from vegetation-related outages and wildfires, which is going to lead to higher costs and increased number of avoidable risks. In the face of these increasing risks, traditional vegetation management methods can be both costly and inefficient. Routine inspection and trimming cycles can miss opportunities to optimize based on risk conditions and forecasting, which is using and wasting precious time and resources. So what's the solution? Data-driven vegetation management can offer some improvements for risk management. By integrating already existing utility data and combining it with modern data sources like LiDAR, satellite imagery, and machine learning models, utilities that can then transform their operations, improving safety and reducing costs. We can do this by leveraging existing data. Utilities have such rich data records, but most of that is siloed away in different departments and underutilized. Integrate modern data sources like satellite and LiDAR, which Caitlin mentioned earlier. A lot of them have publicly free available sources, and there are commercial sources as well for higher resolution, things like that. We can also utilize machine learning models for both event risk prediction and like relative scoring at variable scales. So all the way down from the tree level all the way up to the service territory. We can utilize modern data platforms, the creation of maps, tables, dashboards to aid in operations and scheduling, or just on the ground decision making by inspectors. Next slide. So we can help utilities transform operation by leveraging these existing new data sources, but with modern integrations. So we can tap into the rich data that utilities have. We can use them to inform smarter vegetation management decisions. These can include things like inspection reports, trim and removal activities, any asset management systems, historical maintenance records, and then bringing in LiDAR for 3D detailed mapping and satellite imagery for broad area surveillance. LiDAR can give us information such as tree height, distance from the line, encroachment onto the line, and vegetation insights such as NDVI, which is vegetation greenness and health rating. Satellite data, much of which is publicly available, can give insights into some of the abiotics, some of the non-living factors that drive risk, like slope and water saturation rates that we see tied to things like trunk failure. And we take all these and we help integrate them into systems using GIS systems and platforms to layer the data, to layer the insights, and to be able to make informed decisions and a comprehensive view. Multiple platforms, options exist for this, such as digital twin, dashboards, tablets, but most of all, we turn these into actionable insights. We take these data streams and turn it into insightful information, and then that can allow utilities to prioritize resources where they matter most, when they matter most, which is helping to reduce outages and enhance safety. So risk identification, number one. Our predictive models analyze historical data and real-time inputs. They contain features such as tree species, trim histories, asset proximities, and it's used to identify high-risk trees and spans before they have outages. We can do this either as ranked or targeted mitigation, where you can say, I want to see what the top 10 riskiest spans are within my high fire threat districts. Or we can look at geographic and temporal hotspots. During the spring months, you might have a hotspot that needs extra care. These can be short-term or long-term predictions. Short-term, you can forecast immediate risks like tree limb failure during storms or high wind events. We can even utilize forecasted data, so looking out into the future. We can also do long-term. So long-term models can model hazard conditions over time, which consider factors like tree growth rates, environmental changes, and past performance. So you can find those cycle busters, you can target them. But the big overview of this is to be proactive and not reactive for a vegetation management program. This approach helps utilities transition from reacting to issues as they happen and then trying to fix them to preventing them altogether, which is saving time, money, saving downtime, and increasing safety. And my grandma always said that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So that's kind of the view we take on this. Okay, next. So our solutions leverage machine learning to optimize inspection and trimming schedules as well. So instead of adhering to these static cycles where you hit the same areas the same time every year, utilities can focus resources on high-risk areas first, or you can do it with timing if you have fire season coming, or you know that there's a season where you have lots of storms, you can do that in preparedness. But it ensures that these problems are addressed before issues arise. So models can also guide clearance distance, the seasonality of trim timing, and targeted removals. Some trees, do require removal over trims. But all of this ends in efficient resource allocation. You're integrating tree hazard models, you have more proactive activities and less reactive ones, and this reduces unnecessary truck rolls. It helps combine activities and management areas more efficiently, which saves on operational costs and supplies. But most of all, this helps with preparedness and readiness for events that are going to happen. With predictive data, utilities can allocate crews and resources strategically, which can help focus on high-risk zones before fire seasons or major storm events, which is reducing risk and improving preparedness. We also have PSPS de-energization programs can be informed using these vegetation risk models, particularly for high wind events where vegetation contact chances are very high. Okay. So some of these, we are also able to integrate these insights into tools used by utilities for their planning and tracking. So we have real-time field solutions. Field tablets are used as mobile data collections as well as analysis tools. They can allow crews to view and input tree hazard data right there in the field, making inspections more efficient and accurate. Tools like field tablets can also help crews access and input data and pull relevant data down to ensure they're fully informed when they're making these on-the-spot decisions about tree trimmings or tree removals. This data can include activity history, such as cycle busters, fault and reliability data, growth rates, and strike potential, and overall risk scores. And then on to scheduling. So scheduling and work management platforms can ensure all vegetation management tasks are completed on time and efficiently. Primary inspections, secondary inspections, audit schedules, they can all be optimized using model insights. Trim operations also can be optimized for trim areas to reduce fuels and truck rolls. And then we can take these LiDAR and GIS layers and integrate them into GIS tools to create maps, to analyze high-risk areas in relation to the utility assets, and allowing for precise and actionable vegetation management plans. When we notice where something is, we can send something there. It's creation of maps, graphics, and geographic hotspots to help with decision-making, where you, at a glance, you can tell exactly what new areas need to be targeted. This information and visuals can then be published to dashboards and analytics They can provide full visibility into a whole territory area, the when and the where of vegetation management activities. And then they can allow utility leaders to monitor progress, to assess risk levels, and to prioritize next steps in the program. So just as a quick case study of some work we've done, our client wanted to demonstrate the effectiveness of the vegetation management program in reducing wildfire risks and where optimizations could be made in the program. So we built a machine learning model to predict tree level outage risk based on historical vegetation related outages. The model uses descriptive factors related to the vegetation, such as line clearance distance, species, location, and we utilize previously siloed data. Our analysis allowed us to validate the risk reduction of enhanced clearance practices, including counterfactual simulations. We optimize inspection annual planning with risk prioritization while also considering just regulatory and labor constraints. You only have so many trucks you can roll out. So we can't get all the risky ones first. Improved inspection data availability with updated tree risk estimates for the on-the-ground prioritization by inspectors and historical data perspective. But most of all, we made explainable risk factor analysis. If you can tell exactly where the rankings are and it's easy to interpret, you can pass it across departments and it can be used much more widely across your company. As a result of this work, our insights have been used to influence their PSPS programs, their vegetation management cycle scheduling, as well as their inspection and trim decisions. It has also resulted in improved metrics from California regulators for wildfire preparedness. So using our machine learning predictive insights to drive efficiency. Our advanced analytics empowers utilities to prioritize trimming, inspections, and resource allocation effectively. By leveraging predictive models, utilities can enhance operational efficiency and build a more sustainable, cost-effective vegetation program. We reduce the risk of outages and wildfires using real-time forecast and historical data to predict vegetation-related risks. And then utilities can proactively prevent outages and minimize wildfire threats. This approach improves overall safety and reliability and safeguarding communities and infrastructure. But most of all, it's preparing for increasing vegetation and wildfire risks. As conditions grow drier and hotter, proactive program readiness is essential. Data-driven solutions can equip utilities with the tools and strategies to stay ahead of escalating vegetation risks and ensure resilience in the face of climate change. And with that, I'll hand it over to Adam. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you, Christian. As you've heard here, there are a lot of potential ways to address the wildfire problem as you get into this. The depth of analytics available and the ways that you can bring these different data sets together to create better situational awareness is deep. And as you employ that, it has impacts across many different parts of the business. And so if you could skip to the next slide, please. That can be daunting. What we recommend is that to begin this journey, you focus on establishing a foundational awareness of risk. Bring in some of those fundamental data sets that you may have already into a more compliant format to be able to actually assess and start to estimate what your risk is down to the circuit or even more granular level to make these decisions. Building that sort of foundational map, essentially, of that risk is the first stepping stone to be able to put that into practice in different areas of your operation. So in tandem, what we recommend and have seen work well is a cross-functional WMP department that is bringing together stakeholders from vegetation management, asset planning, emergency operations, risk management, technology, because they're all going to be impacted as you build these out. The positive side of that is as you increase this risk awareness and create this foundation around situational awareness of wildfire and the assets and vegetation, you're opening up these opportunities that Christian described for bringing risk into the decision-making process and being more efficient as you do and being auditable as you do, so that you are presenting to regulators a very strong argument about how you are improving safety and reliability and how that investment is well spent. And you know yourself that the changes made to these departments and their operations are grounded in a strong understanding of where they're going to have the best impact. So starting simply, getting all those people to the table, making the strategy for the WMP something that is agreed upon and understood as it impacts those processes. That's really the way to get started. And as you go deeper, you will be able to advance into some of those use cases that Christian described, of bringing more advanced techniques and data to the table and make this more and more efficient and integrated to the general operation. So with that, we'll stop there. I hope it's been insightful. We're very happy to answer any questions, and we'll open up the floor now. I'm looking to our moderators here just in case I'm missing anything. Want to make sure that any questions get addressed.
Yeah, I do think we have a question, Adam, so I'll go ahead and read it out. So given the regulatory landscape around wildfire mitigation, how can utilities effectively balance compliance requirements with the need for innovative data-driven approaches to risk management?
Got it. So I think these are not entirely in conflict. So the regulatory requirements are often asking for higher frequency and more enhanced clearances or other enhanced practices where it is effective. And what I most typically see is even if you put forward blanket practices, regulators will come back asking for effectiveness metrics and backing for those decisions. So really, if you start from that standpoint of using data on the risk to drive your policies, that is to tune your cycles or to tune your clearances or any other practices that you bring to the table, that tends to actually meet regulators where they want to be met in the long run.
Great, thank you, Adam. I would add too, a number of utilities have proactively filed WMPs, even though there is not regulation in place at a state or federal level right now for those utilities. It's a great way to show thought leadership in the space, to get ahead of any regulatory requirements that might come about, and to start investing in data, making data more standard and actionable, as that is always a benefit from a regulatory perspective. I think we have one on vegetation management, Christian. Let's see. What would you say to utilities that don't have a tree inventory? Are these utilities still set up to start risk modeling for vegetation management?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It's wonderful when there's very granular tree level data, but we can absolutely scale out for the resolution on the models. We can utilize lots of publicly available and commercially available data to supplement, as well as just making our targets maybe a little bit larger than they would for small granular data.
Yeah, I'd like to just add to that a little bit. On the one hand, I do agree. There are options available to still conduct the analysis with that level without that fidelity in cataloging trees, and potentially even bringing some things to the table like satellite imagery to help you identify strike potential trees and start building that catalog from that perspective. However, I would also highlight that, as I said, this should be cross-functional when you roll this out. And enhancements to your process that capture better data, that give you better decision-making, need to be on the table. And so as you go into the analysis, if that becomes a stumbling block, you may want to consider changes to your field operations such that you're capturing more comprehensively what there is in the field. It's I think just worth keeping in mind that you have the data that you have today, and there's also the data that's available publicly. But sometimes small process changes can really increase your situational awareness.
Awesome. Thanks, Christian and Adam, for those responses. I think we have at least one more question. Let's see. How can utilities in areas that are newly vulnerable to wildfires and who have less advanced data quality build scalable wildfire mitigation programs, focusing on the most critical elements?
Yeah, I'd be happy to tackle that one. So, some of the things that we talked about here are not major investments. Some of the data that's required are fundamental things that either you will already have in-house or can be captured publicly. And the analysis to bring those together at least on an annual basis and use that to guide some of your planning is not a huge investment. And that's where I would start. Looking at an annual refresh of where you're seeing most or least risk, and using that to help guide your vegetation and asset management programs, I think is the right start. You can go from there into, is PSPS a right consideration for you? Is hardening, covered conductor, undergrounding, other kinds of programs like that, are those the right choice? And ideally build that out into a cost benefit calculation that you can use to tune that portfolio. But start simply. It would be my short advice.
Yeah, it's really not an all or nothing, right? Risk modeling and insights can augment decision processes that are already in place, or even be used to give additional information around investments that are already planned. Utilities may already be choosing to underground certain lines and may already be in the permitting process there. Same thing with covered conductor. Adam, you mentioned those. Those are kind of like the two mitigations of choice on the West Coast for reducing ignition risk. Also things like replacing wood poles with steel poles. Utilities may already be planning this as a part of grid hardening or a part of construction. And so risk modeling can kind of confirm, yes, those are the right, most cost-effective methods. I don't think we have any more questions. If anyone does have a question, feel free to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. It's a little icon that says Q&A. We have time to answer a few more if anyone has anything. All right, I don't see anything else popping into the Q&A, so I think we can close things out here. Really want to thank everybody for joining, for your engagement and your time. We really appreciate it. And please reach out if you would like to learn more. We're happy to connect with you. Thank you all.
Thank you.